The first gunshot echoed through St. Gabriel Medical Center at 2:17 in the morning. A nurse dropped a tray. Patients screamed. Security officers ran toward the emergency wing and never came back. Within minutes, armed men controlled the main corridors, the exits were sealed, and more than 100 patients and staff were trapped inside the hospital. Near the records desk on the third floor, a quiet ward clerk named Ethan Walker stood frozen beside a cart of patient files. Nobody looked at him twice. Not Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Not charge nurse Olivia Bennett. Not even the frightened security supervisor, Mark Reyes. To them, Ethan was just the clerk who worked night shifts and rarely spoke. But as panic spread through the building, Ethan saw something the others did not. The gunmen were making mistakes. And before the night was over, one calm order from the man everyone overlooked would change the fate of everyone inside the hospital. They thought he was just a ward clerk. They were wrong. St. Gabriel Medical Center never truly slept. Even after midnight, the hospital moved with its own quiet rhythm. Monitors beeped behind closed doors. Nurses pushed medication carts through dim corridors. Doctors reviewed charts beneath fluorescent lights that never seemed to change, no matter the hour. Most people who worked nights developed a routine. They learned which hallways stayed quiet, which patients needed extra attention, which alarms could wait 3 seconds before causing panic, and which people mattered. That last category rarely included Ethan Walker. At least, that was what most employees believed. Ethan worked as a ward clerk on the third floor. His responsibilities were simple. He moved paperwork between departments, updated records, coordinated patient transfers, and handled dozens of small administrative tasks that nobody noticed unless they stopped getting done. At 38 years old, he had been at St. Gabriel for almost 2 years. Most staff knew his name. Very few knew anything else. He never joined conversations in the break room. He never talked about his past. He arrived on time, did his job, and left quietly at the end of every shift. To many people, he seemed forgettable. That night began like any other. Charge nurse Olivia Bennett stood behind the nursing station reviewing patient assignments. "Ethan," she called without looking up. He approached immediately. "Room 312 needs updated records sent to ICU." "I'll take care of it. And transport is running behind again." "I noticed." Olivia sighed. "Of course you did." It was a common response. Ethan noticed everything. Not in a dramatic way. Just small details. The kind most people ignored. A supply cart missing equipment. A patient whose breathing pattern changed slightly. A security camera that pointed 2 degrees away from its normal position. Things that seemed unimportant. Until they weren't. He carried a folder toward the elevators and passed Dr. Sarah Mitchell leaving the emergency department. Sarah was one of the most respected physicians in the hospital. Brilliant. Focused. Always exhausted. She glanced at him. "Long night." Ethan gave a small smile. "They usually are. Not for you. No. You look calmer than everyone else." She continued walking before he could answer. The comment stayed with him. People often mistook calmness for simplicity. They assumed that because someone wasn't loud, they weren't capable. Ethan had learned years ago that correcting those assumptions was usually a waste of time. Near 1 in the morning, he stopped by the security office. Mark Reyes sat behind a desk watching camera feeds. The supervisor rubbed tired eyes. "Ethan." "Mark. You bringing paperwork or bad news?" "Neither." Mark laughed. "Good. That's rare." Ethan looked toward the monitors. More than 60 camera views covered different parts of the hospital. Parking lots, entrances, hallways, loading docks. Most displayed nothing unusual. Yet Ethan studied them for several seconds longer than necessary. Mark noticed. "What are you looking at?" Ethan shrugged. "Nothing." But it wasn't exactly nothing. One delivery van sat near the service entrance. Hospitals received deliveries all the time. There was no obvious reason for concern. Still, something felt slightly wrong. Not dangerous. Just unusual. The van had been parked in the same position for nearly 20 minutes. Longer than most delivery vehicles stayed. Mark followed his gaze. The van. Probably nothing. Then why are you staring at it? Ethan looked away. Habit. Mark shook his head. You noticed too much. Maybe. Or maybe other people noticed too little. Back on the third floor, Ethan resumed work. A patient needed records transferred. A physician requested laboratory updates. A nurse needed assistance locating archived files. The hours passed quietly. At approximately 1:40 a.m., a young nurse named Emily Carter hurried from ICU carrying medication reports. She nearly collided with Ethan. Sorry. No problem. Emily adjusted the papers in her hands. I don't know how you stay so calm. Ethan looked at her. Why? Everyone is stressed. You seem stressed. I am stressed. He nodded. Then handle one thing at a time. Emily laughed softly. That's your advice. It's worked so far. She walked away smiling. Simple advice. Simple words. Yet somehow people often felt better after speaking with him, even when he said very little. A few minutes later, Ethan entered a storage room to retrieve archived files. The room was silent. Cool. Organized. He placed a box onto a shelf and paused. Listening. Nothing unusual. Just the distant sounds of a hospital at night. Still, something felt different. Not wrong. Not yet. Just different. The sensation had followed him for nearly an hour. A subtle feeling that pieces were moving somewhere beyond his view. Most people ignored instincts. Ethan never had. Experience had taught him that major disasters often announced themselves quietly before they arrived loudly. When he returned to the corridor, the floor seemed unchanged. Nurses worked. Patients rested. Monitors continued their steady rhythm. Life moved forward normally. But Ethan noticed something else. Security radio traffic had become less frequent. Not absent. Just reduced. Another small detail. Another tiny change. One that probably meant nothing. Yet he remembered it. Because remembering details had once been the difference between life and death. At 2:05 a.m., he stood beside the nursing station updating transfer records. Olivia reviewed charts nearby. Dr. Sarah Mitchell entered from the elevator. The hospital appeared calm. Stable. Safe. Exactly as it should. No one in the corridor realized they were less than 15 minutes away from the worst night of their lives. And no one, not Olivia, not Sarah, not Mark Reyes, not a single person inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, looked at the quiet ward clerk standing beside a computer terminal and imagined he would soon become the most important person in the building. Because at that moment, Ethan Walker was exactly what everyone believed him to be. A man nobody noticed. The first sign was not a gunshot. It was silence. At 2:07 a.m., Ethan Walker stood at the nursing station entering transfer information into the hospital database when he noticed something unusual. A security radio had gone quiet. Normally, background communication flowed constantly through the building. Short updates. Door checks. Routine reports. Most people barely noticed the noise. Ethan noticed when it disappeared. He glanced toward the clock. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Still nothing. Across the station, Olivia Bennett continued reviewing patient charts. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was discussing laboratory results with another physician. No one appeared concerned. Why would they be? Hospitals experienced communication issues all the time. But Ethan remembered the feeling that had followed him throughout the night. The delivery van. The missing radio traffic. The growing sense that pieces were moving somewhere beyond view. He opened a maintenance terminal and checked internal service logs. Nothing unusual appeared. No alarms. No security alerts. No emergency notices. Everything looked normal. Sometimes that was what worried him most. At 2:10 a.m., Mark Reyes finally responded to a radio check. His voice sounded strained. Brief. Different. Ethan couldn't explain why. But he heard it immediately. The same way a musician hears a wrong note. The words themselves were normal. The tone wasn't. A few floors below, Emily Carter exited the ICU carrying medication supplies. She stopped near Ethan. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever get nervous? He looked at her. About what? Anything. Ethan considered the question. Everyone gets nervous. You don't seem like it. Looks can be misleading. Emily smiled. That sounds mysterious. It isn't. Before she could continue, her pager activated. She hurried away. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet Ethan watched her leave. Not because of what she said. Because of what he noticed. People were moving faster. Not running. Not panicking. Just slightly faster than normal. Small changes. Small signals. The kind most people ignored. At 2:12 a.m., a maintenance worker entered through a side corridor. His expression looked confused. He approached the nursing station. Has anyone seen security? Olivia looked up. What happened? The loading dock camera feed is offline. Probably a technical issue. Maybe. The worker didn't sound convinced. Neither was Ethan. Still, there wasn't enough information to justify concern. Not yet. The maintenance worker left. The corridor returned to normal. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then Ethan noticed another detail. The elevator near the service wing stopped responding. Not broken. Just unavailable. Its indicator remained fixed on the ground floor. Again, it could mean nothing. Hospitals were complicated buildings. Equipment failed every day. But the pattern was growing. One strange event could be coincidence. 3 or 4 became harder to ignore. At 2:14 a.m., Ethan decided to walk toward the east stairwell. No particular reason. Just instinct. The corridor was nearly empty. A television in the waiting area played muted overnight news. An elderly patient slept in a wheelchair. 2 nurses discussed medication schedules. Everything appeared ordinary. Yet as Ethan approached a window overlooking the parking area, he stopped. The delivery van was still there. Now it wasn't alone. A dark SUV had parked nearby. No hospital markings. No company logo. No visible reason to be there. He watched for several seconds. Nothing happened. No one exited. No one entered. Just 2 vehicles sitting quietly in the darkness. A chill moved through him. Not fear. Recognition. The feeling that comes when scattered pieces begin forming a picture. Unfortunately, the picture was still incomplete. He turned away and headed toward the security office. If something was wrong, Mark would know. But halfway there, his phone vibrated. A routine transport request. Room 318. Nothing urgent. Nothing unusual. The ordinary world continued demanding attention. That was the strange thing about disasters. Life rarely paused to announce them. People filled out paperwork, answered emails, checked medication doses. Then suddenly everything changed. At 2:16 a.m., Ethan reached the security office door. It was closed. Locked. That alone was unusual. Mark almost never locked it while on duty. Ethan knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. The silence on the other side felt heavy. Wrong. His instincts sharpened immediately. For the first time that night, genuine concern appeared on his face. Not panic. Concern. He stepped back from the door and listened carefully. Nothing. No movement. No voices. No sound at all. Then, from somewhere far below in the building, a noise echoed faintly through the corridor. A metallic crash. Distant. Violent. Followed by silence. Several nurses looked up. A doctor paused mid-conversation. The hospital seemed to hold its breath. "What was that?" someone asked. Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Yet Ethan did know one thing. Whatever was happening downstairs had just crossed a line. The small warning signs were over. Something had finally begun. And within the next 60 seconds, St. Gabriel Medical Center would become a battlefield. The first gunshot shattered the illusion of normalcy. It echoed upward through the stairwells and corridors with a sharp, unmistakable crack. For half a second, nobody moved. The sound felt impossible. Wrong. Like something that did not belong inside a hospital. Then came a second shot. And a third. The reaction was immediate. Nurses froze. Patients screamed. A visitor dropped a coffee cup that shattered across the floor. Every conversation stopped at once. Fear spread faster than information. What was that? Was that gunfire? Call security. Lock the doors. Voices overlapped throughout the corridor. Ethan Walker stood perfectly still, listening. Not to the panic. To the pattern. 3 shots. A pause. Then shouting somewhere below. His expression hardened. The uncertainty was gone now. This was real. Across the nursing station, Olivia Bennett looked toward him. For the first time that night, she saw something different in his face. Not fear. Assessment. The look of someone calculating. "Ethan," she asked. He turned immediately. "Get every patient away from windows." "What? Now?" Something in his voice made her move without argument. Within seconds, Olivia began directing nurses into rooms. The 3rd floor erupted into controlled chaos. At the same moment, Dr. Sarah Mitchell grabbed a hospital phone. The line was dead. She tried another. Nothing. A third. Still nothing. The realization hit her hard. Communication had been cut. Downstairs, more shouting echoed through the building. A frightened orderly rushed from the stairwell. His face was pale. "They have guns." The corridor fell silent. "What?" Sarah asked. "There are armed men downstairs." Nobody spoke. For several seconds, the reality refused to settle. Armed men. Inside the hospital. It sounded unreal. Yet the fear in the orderly's eyes removed all doubt. Another burst of gunfire echoed from below. Closer this time. A patient began crying. A nurse covered her mouth. Someone whispered a prayer. The crisis had arrived. Fast. Brutal. Without warning. Ethan moved toward the nearest window and carefully looked outside. The dark SUV remained in the parking lot. Now its doors stood open. Several figures moved near the service entrance. Organized. Purposeful. This wasn't random violence. This was planned. Every detail from the past hour suddenly connected. The delivery van. The missing security communications. The disabled cameras. The locked security office. Preparation. Coordination. A deliberate operation. Behind him, panic continued growing. What do we do? Where is security? Has anyone called police? Questions filled the corridor. Few answers existed. Then the overhead speaker system activated. Static crackled. A man's voice followed. Cold. Controlled. Unfamiliar. Remain where you are. The message echoed through the hospital. We control this building. Several people gasped. The voice continued. Anyone attempting to leave designated areas will be treated as a threat. Silence followed. Heavy silence. The kind that appears when fear becomes real. Ethan listened carefully. No emotion. No excitement. The speaker sounded disciplined. Experienced. That concerned him more than rage would have. Because calm men were often the most dangerous. Sarah looked toward the gathered staff. We need to secure this floor. Nobody disagreed. The challenge was obvious. Hospitals were not designed to withstand sieges. There were too many patients. Too many entrances. Too many vulnerable people. And somewhere inside the building, armed attackers were taking control. At 2:23 a.m., another staff member arrived from a lower level. Breathing hard. Terrified. The lobby is gone. What do you mean gone? Olivia asked. They took it. The nurse struggled to catch her breath. Security was overwhelmed. The word struck like a physical blow. Security was supposed to delay threats. Provide warnings. Create time. If they were already overwhelmed, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ethan considered the information. The attackers controlled the lobby. Possibly the loading dock. Likely several access points. That meant they understood movement. They understood choke points. This was not a spontaneous attack. His mind continued building the picture. Without realizing it, he began identifying options. Routes. Resources. Potential safe areas. The process felt automatic. Familiar. Years of habit returning quietly beneath the surface. Sarah noticed him studying the floor map mounted near the station. "What are you thinking?" Ethan answered honestly. "How much of the building they've taken." The doctor stared at him. Most people were focused on fear. He was focused on positioning. The difference stood out. Before she could ask another question, a frightened voice interrupted. "There's someone coming." Everyone turned. A figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. For one terrifying second, staff feared it was an attacker. Then relief spread. It was Mark Reyes, the security supervisor. But something was wrong. He was injured. Blood stained his sleeve. His uniform was torn. He moved quickly toward them. As soon as he reached the station, Sarah helped him sit. "What happened?" Mark took a breath. "There are at least 8 of them." The corridor became completely silent. "Maybe more." His voice shook. They knew exactly where to go. Nobody interrupted. They hit security first. Ethan watched carefully. Mark wasn't exaggerating. He was reporting. That mattered. "Who are they?" Olivia asked. "I don't know." Mark looked around the room. "But they planned this." The statement confirmed Ethan's assessment. Mark continued. "They have radios, weapons, body armor." Every new detail made the situation worse. A frightened nurse began crying quietly. Another sat beside a patient, trying to stay calm. The atmosphere changed completely. The hospital no longer felt like a hospital. It felt occupied. And everyone knew it. Then Mark said something that caught Ethan's attention. "They keep asking about someone." Sarah frowned. "Who?" "I don't know." Mark shook his head. "They haven't said." The answer created more questions than it solved. Someone. The attackers were looking for someone. Not money. Not supplies. Not random destruction. A target. The realization settled heavily over the corridor. This siege had a purpose. A reason. And until they understood it, nobody inside St. Gabriel Medical Center was safe. As fear tightened its grip on the floor, Ethan Walker looked toward the stairwell. His expression remained calm. Measured. Focused. The others still saw a ward clerk. A quiet employee trapped. Fear settled over the 3rd floor like a heavy fog. Nobody knew exactly what was happening elsewhere in the hospital. That uncertainty made everything worse. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed police had already arrived. Others thought the attackers controlled the entire building. Nobody could confirm anything. The lack of information became its own threat. Ethan Walker stood near the nursing station studying a floor map. Not because he needed it. Because he wanted others to believe he did. In reality, he had already memorized most of the building during his first months at St. Gabriel. Every stairwell. Every maintenance corridor. Every emergency access route. Knowledge mattered during crises. Especially when panic clouded judgment. Across the station, Mark Reyes received a weak transmission through a damaged security radio. Static filled the room. Broken words emerged. Then silence returned. "What did they say?" Olivia asked. Mark shook his head. "Couldn't tell." The signal disappeared again. The floor felt increasingly isolated. Cut off from the outside world. At 2:31 a.m., the situation changed. Footsteps echoed from the far stairwell. Heavy. Deliberate. Several people heard them simultaneously. The corridor froze. Patients stopped speaking. Staff turned toward the sound. The footsteps grew closer. Then stopped. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A moment later, the stairwell door opened. An armed man stepped into view. The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Fear. Movement. Several nurses instinctively backed away. The attacker scanned the corridor, rifle in hand, body armor covering his chest. His eyes moved from room to room, searching, looking for something, or someone. Ethan watched carefully. Not the weapon, the man. The way he moved, the way he observed, the way he controlled the corridor without speaking. Professional, not military, but trained. That distinction mattered. The attacker pointed toward the station. You. His voice echoed sharply. Everyone looked around. The rifle shifted, now aimed directly at Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Doctor. Sarah's face tightened. Come here. Nobody moved. The tension became unbearable. Ethan quietly stepped sideways, positioning himself between several frightened patients and the center of the corridor. The movement appeared casual, almost invisible, but it created a layer of protection. One more obstacle. One more second if something went wrong. The attacker noticed Sarah's hesitation. No. Slowly, she walked forward. The entire floor watched. Terrified. The attacker stopped several feet away. How many patients on this level? Sarah swallowed. 43. Critical patients. 7. The man nodded. He seemed interested only in information, not intimidation. That was almost more concerning. Discipline threats were harder to predict. The questioning continued. Simple, direct, efficient. Then the attacker asked another question, one that immediately caught Ethan's attention. Any recent transfers from federal custody? Sarah frowned. No. The attacker studied her face, trying to determine whether she was lying. Apparently satisfied, he stepped back. Then his eyes moved across the corridor, examining every face, one by one. For a brief moment, they landed on Ethan. Neither man reacted, yet something passed between them. Recognition. Not personal recognition. Professional awareness. The attacker looked away first. Then he returned to the stairwell. The door closed behind him. Only after the footsteps faded did people begin breathing normally again. Several nurses sat down immediately. Others fought tears. The emotional pressure was becoming overwhelming. Sarah returned to the station. He wasn't looking for patients. Nobody answered, because everyone understood. The attackers were hunting someone. The question remained the same. Who? Mark leaned against the counter. They've been asking similar questions everywhere. About federal custody? Olivia asked. Mark nodded. Apparently. The information created a new layer of uncertainty. A target inside the hospital. Or someone the attackers believed was inside. Either possibility was dangerous. Ethan remained quiet, thinking, building possibilities. The attacker had revealed more than intended. Questions often did, especially during stressful situations. Across the floor, Emily Carter struggled to calm an elderly cardiac patient named Robert Hayes. The man looked terrified. His hands trembled. His heart monitor reflected the stress. Ethan walked over. Robert looked at him immediately. Are we going to die? The question hung heavily in the room. No dramatic speech could answer it. No false promise would help. Ethan pulled a chair closer. No. Robert stared at him. You sound sure. I'm sure of one thing. What? We keep moving one step at a time. The elderly man slowly relaxed. Not completely, but enough. Sometimes confidence mattered more than certainty. Emily noticed it too. The effect Ethan had on people. The way frightened individuals seemed calmer after speaking with him, even though he rarely said much. At 2:40 a.m., another problem emerged. A patient in room 318 began deteriorating rapidly. Medical intervention was required immediately. The crisis created a difficult choice. Treat the patient and increase activity on the floor, or delay treatment and risk losing a life. Sarah didn't hesitate. We treat him. Everyone agreed, because hospitals existed for one purpose: saving people, even during disasters. As nurses rushed into action, Ethan quietly assisted. Moving equipment, clearing routes, coordinating supplies, never taking control, never drawing attention. Yet somehow everything flowed more smoothly when he was involved. Sarah noticed. Again, the realization grew stronger. The quiet ward clerk was not what he appeared to be. She still couldn't explain why. Only that his behavior felt different. Too controlled. Too deliberate. Too calm. The floor remained under threat. Armed men still occupied parts of the hospital. The siege was far from over. But for the first time since the attack began, people found something resembling stability. Not safety. Not hope. Just stability. A small but important difference. And at the center of it stood Ethan Walker. Still unnoticed by most. Still underestimated. Yet quietly becoming the person everyone would soon depend upon. Without even realizing it. By 2:50 a.m., nearly 40 minutes had passed since the first gunshots. The initial panic had faded. Not because people felt safe. Because exhaustion was replacing fear. Maintaining terror required energy. Eventually, reality took over. Patients still needed medication. Machines still required monitoring. Lives still depended on the staff doing their jobs. The hospital continued functioning, even under occupation. Ethan Walker used that reality to his advantage. While others focused on surviving minute by minute, he focused on understanding the battlefield. He moved through the third floor carrying charts and supply requests. To everyone else, he appeared to be doing his normal duties. In reality, he was collecting information. Which hallways remained clear? Which doors were locked? Which stairwells were monitored? Which staff members could remain calm under pressure? Every detail mattered. Near the nurses' station, Mark Reyes sat with a bandaged arm. The security supervisor looked exhausted. Ethan handed him a bottle of water. "How many entrances?" Ethan asked quietly. Mark frowned. "What? How many entrances are they controlling?" The question surprised him. Most people were asking if help was coming. Ethan was asking about positions. Mark thought for a moment. Main lobby. Loading dock. Probably emergency access. Ethan nodded. The answer confirmed his concerns. The attackers understood movement. They had seized the building's most important access points first. That required planning, training, discipline. Mark watched him carefully. "You've been thinking about this differently than everyone else." Ethan didn't answer. Mark continued. "Who are you, Ethan?" A small smile appeared. "Just a ward clerk." Mark almost laughed. For the first time all night, he didn't believe it. A sudden commotion interrupted them. Two nurses rushed from a nearby room. One looked frightened. The oxygen regulator failed. Sarah Mitchell immediately moved to assist. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed a backup unit and arrived moments later. The replacement was installed within seconds. The patient's condition stabilized. The crisis ended. Small. Routine. Yet Sarah noticed something. Ethan had reached the equipment before anyone told him where it was stored. An unusual detail. Another piece of a growing puzzle. As the floor settled again, Ethan walked toward a window overlooking the eastern side of the hospital. Outside, flashing police lights illuminated the darkness. Relief spread through him. Not because police had arrived. Because it meant the situation was finally contained externally. The attackers could still control the hospital. But they could no longer disappear. That changed everything. A few minutes later, Mark's damaged radio crackled unexpectedly. Static filled the room. Then a voice emerged. Weak but understandable. Security teams respond. More static. Emergency command established. The signal faded again. Yet one fact remained. Outside authorities were organizing. The siege had entered a new phase. Olivia Bennett looked relieved. "They know we're here." "Yes," Ethan said. But his expression remained serious. Recognition alone solved nothing. The dangerous part still lay ahead. Because eventually, someone would attempt to end the standoff. And endings were often when people got hurt. At approximately 3 a.m., another armed attacker appeared briefly on the floor. This time he remained only long enough to observe. No questions. No threats. Just observation. That worried Ethan more. Observation meant preparation. Preparation meant change. The attackers were adapting. He waited until the man disappeared before speaking quietly to Mark. "They're nervous." Mark blinked. "What makes you think that?" "They've started checking positions more frequently." The security supervisor looked confused. "That's bad. It means they're expecting something." The realization hit Mark immediately. Police. A response team. External pressure. The attackers knew time was no longer on their side. And desperate people often made dangerous decisions. Across the floor, Emily Carter approached Ethan. She looked exhausted. "When this is over," she said softly, "I'm taking a month off." For the first time that night, Ethan laughed. A small laugh. Brief. Human. "I think you've earned it." Emily smiled. Then her expression became serious. "You really aren't scared, are you?" He considered the question carefully. "Of course I am. You don't act like it." Ethan looked toward the corridor. Fear was everywhere. In every room. On every face. Acting scared doesn't help people. Emily followed his gaze. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then she nodded, understanding more than his words revealed. As the night continued, a quiet shift occurred on the third floor. Nobody announced it. Nobody voted on it. Yet it happened anyway. People began looking toward Ethan when problems appeared. When decisions needed making. When uncertainty grew. Not because he demanded authority. Because competence naturally attracted trust. The process was gradual. Almost invisible. But it was happening. And Ethan knew it couldn't continue forever. Sooner or later, someone would ask questions he could no longer avoid. Sooner or later, the role of ward clerk would not be enough. For now, however, he remained exactly where he needed to be. Watching. Listening. Assessing. Waiting for the moment when action became unavoidable. Because deep down, he already knew something the others did not. The siege was getting worse. And before dawn arrived, everyone trapped inside St. Gabriel Medical Center would face a choice that changed them forever. At 3:08 a.m., the fragile stability on the third floor finally broke. A frightened orderly burst through the stairwell door. He was breathing hard. His face was pale. "They found them." The room immediately went silent. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward. "Found who?" "The patients hiding in physical therapy." A heavy feeling settled across the floor. Everyone understood the danger. Earlier, several staff members from lower levels had moved vulnerable patients into unused treatment areas, hoping to keep them out of sight. Apparently, that plan had failed. "What happened?" Olivia asked. The orderly swallowed. "They moved everyone." "Where?" "I don't know." The answer was enough. Fear returned immediately. Not loud panic. Something worse. The realization that nowhere in the hospital might truly be safe. Ethan watched the reactions around him. People were reaching a breaking point. Fatigue. Stress. Uncertainty. Those things accumulated over time. Eventually they became as dangerous as the attackers themselves. Another problem appeared minutes later. One of the ICU patients began deteriorating rapidly. An elderly woman named Margaret Lewis required specialized medication from another floor. Without it, her condition could become critical. Sarah reviewed the chart. Her expression tightened. "We need those medications." Nobody volunteered. Not because they lacked courage. Because the route crossed areas potentially controlled by armed men. The risk was obvious. Sarah looked around the room. Then Ethan spoke. "I'll go." Several heads turned. Olivia frowned. "No. I know the storage locations." "So does half the hospital." Ethan remained calm. "Then send someone else." Nobody answered. The silence said everything. Everyone knew the truth. The task needed doing, and nobody wanted to ask another person to take the risk. Finally, Sarah sighed. "We go together." Ethan shook his head. "You have patience." The doctor stared at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." A faint smile crossed his face. "I always am." The journey took him through service corridors and secondary hallways rarely used during normal operations. The hospital felt different now. Quieter. Tense. Like a building holding its breath. Every sound seemed amplified. Every corner carried uncertainty. As he moved, Ethan observed more evidence of organization. Certain access points were blocked. Others remained open. The pattern wasn't random. Someone was directing movement carefully. The attackers had a plan. That worried him, because disciplined plans usually included contingencies. Near the pharmacy storage area, Ethan paused. Voices echoed nearby. 2 armed men. Discussing positions. Waiting. Listening. He remained perfectly still. Not hiding dramatically. Simply becoming part of the environment. A forgotten employee pushing a supply cart. Nothing more. The conversation lasted less than a minute before the men moved away. Only then did Ethan continue. Minutes later, he secured the medication and began returning. But during the trip back, he discovered something important. Very important. A closed conference room near the administrative wing. 2 armed guards positioned outside. Far more security than the room appeared to require. Ethan didn't stare. Didn't slow down. Didn't attract attention. Yet he understood immediately. Whatever the attackers wanted was probably inside that room. A hostage. A target. Or someone connected to the reason for the siege. The discovery answered one question, and created many more. Back on the 3rd floor, Sarah administered the medication successfully. Margaret Lewis stabilized. 1 life saved. For the moment. But Ethan's mind remained focused elsewhere. The guarded conference room. The unusual security. The attackers' repeated questions. The pieces were moving closer together. At approximately 3:25 a.m., another development arrived. Mark Reyes managed to establish brief communication with emergency responders outside. The connection lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it changed everything. "They're preparing something." Mark lowered the radio. "What kind of something?" Olivia asked. "I don't know." But Ethan did. Or at least he understood the possibilities. External teams were gathering information. Building plans. Threat assessments. Hostage counts. The process had begun. Which meant time was shrinking. For everyone. Including the attackers. A few minutes later, Emily Carter approached carrying fresh supplies. Her hands trembled slightly. She was trying hard to hide it. Ethan noticed. "You should sit down for 5 minutes." She looked surprised. "We're in the middle of a siege. You're still human." Emily almost smiled. Almost. Instead, she sat beside the nursing station. For the first time in hours. The gesture seemed small. But it mattered. Because leadership wasn't always about action. Sometimes it meant protecting people from their own determination. As the night continued, tension increased across the hospital. More reports arrived. More uncertainty. More evidence that both sides were preparing for what came next. Then, shortly before 3:40 a.m., another announcement echoed through the speaker system. The same cold voice. The same controlled tone. "Remain in your assigned locations." Static followed. Then another sentence. One that changed everything. "Our objective is close." The message ended immediately. No explanation. No details. Yet Ethan felt the effect instantly. The attackers believed they were nearing success. That made them unpredictable. Dangerous. Because people who believed victory was close often took greater risks. The 3rd floor grew quieter after that. Staff exchanged nervous glances. Patients whispered fears. Nobody liked the sound of that announcement. Neither did Ethan. He stood beside a window watching distant emergency lights flash beyond the hospital grounds. The night was moving toward a conclusion. He could feel it. The problem was that conclusions often carried the highest cost. And for the first time since the siege began, Ethan Walker faced a question he could no longer ignore. If the situation collapsed completely, how much of his past was he willing to reveal to save the people around him? By 3:45 a.m., exhaustion had replaced fear on most faces. Not because the danger was gone, because the human body eventually ran out of ways to stay terrified. On the third floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center, people were still alive, still working, still treating patients trapped inside a building under siege. But the emotional strain had changed everything. Movements were slower, voices quieter, decisions heavier. Ethan Walker stood near the nursing station reviewing supply levels when Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached him. Her expression was different now. Not skeptical, not confused, careful. "We're running low on trauma packs," she said. "I know. You know everything, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, because the question wasn't really about supplies. It was about him. Instead, he said, "The loading dock storage still has backup kits." Sarah studied him. "How do you know that without checking?" A pause. Then Ethan replied, "Because hospitals always store redundancies near secondary exits." A reasonable answer, but not the full truth. Sarah didn't push further. Not yet. Across the corridor, Mark Reyes was speaking with a weakened radio signal again. The connection came and went. Fragments of external communication filtered in. Hostage situation confirmed. Tactical units assembling. ETA unknown. Then silence. The outside world was getting closer. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. Because external intervention meant escalation. And escalation meant unpredictable violence. At 3:52 a.m., everything changed again. A young nurse named Emily Carter rushed into the station, breathless. They found another group. Sarah turned immediately. "Where?" "The pediatric wing." The words hit the room harder than expected. Children. Patients who had no understanding of the situation. No ability to process fear. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Olivia Bennett closed her eyes for a brief second. "That wing is not secured," she whispered. Mark stood up. "We need security coverage there." Sarah looked at Ethan. And this time, she didn't hesitate. "What do we do?" It was the first time she had asked him that directly. Not as a clerk. Not as a colleague. But as someone expected to know. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Moving everyone now will expose them. Staying puts them at risk," Olivia said. He nodded. "Yes." A difficult silence followed. Then Ethan made a decision. "We don't move them blindly." He turned toward Mark. "Can you get me live positioning from the cameras?" Mark hesitated. "Some are down. Use the ones that aren't." A pause. Then Mark nodded. "Give me 2 minutes." Sarah watched Ethan carefully. "You're planning something." "I'm trying to reduce exposure." That sounds like military language. Ethan didn't deny it, because denying it would have been meaningless. For the first time, Olivia spoke more softly. "Who are you really?" Ethan looked at her. A long pause followed. "Then, someone trying to keep people alive tonight." That answer ended the question for the moment. But not the suspicion. Not entirely. Within minutes, Mark returned with partial camera feeds. Ethan studied them carefully. Not like a clerk. Not like an administrator. Like someone reading a battlefield. Then he pointed. "Here. A corridor section near maintenance access. Move them through this route." Sarah frowned. "That passes near a monitored zone. It passes a blind spot before it passes anything else." Mark zoomed in on the feed. He saw it too. A narrow corridor. Unmonitored for exactly 40 seconds between camera rotations. Enough time. Barely. Sarah still hesitated. "If this is wrong..." "It isn't," Ethan said quietly. "No arrogance. No force. Just certainty shaped by experience. That was what finally made her agree. "Do it," she said. Emily immediately moved toward the pediatric wing coordination team. Olivia followed. Mark adjusted the radio channels. The plan began moving. Ethan did not go with them. Instead, he stayed at the station, watching, listening, counting seconds. Because leadership during crisis wasn't always about being in front. Sometimes it was about understanding where failure would happen before it did. Minutes passed. Then, Mark's radio crackled sharply. Movement confirmed, safe passage complete. A breath of relief spread across the station. Not loud, not celebratory, just relief. A group of vulnerable patients had been moved without incident. Sarah looked at Ethan again. This time, something had changed. Not trust completely, but recognition. "You've done this before," she said. Ethan didn't respond. Because the truth wasn't simple. And simplicity was all the room could handle right now. At 4:05 a.m., the situation worsened again. A loud crash echoed from the lower floors, followed by shouting. Then gunfire. Short, controlled, but closer than before. Everyone froze. Olivia whispered, "They're moving upward." Mark checked the radio. "They're clearing sections." Ethan's expression tightened slightly. Not clearing. A pause. Advancing. That distinction mattered. Clearing suggested caution. Advancing suggested urgency, which meant something had changed in the attacker's objective. Sarah looked toward him. What changed? Ethan stared toward the stairwell. "I think they found what they were looking for." The words hung in the air, heavy, unfinished, and deeply concerning. Because if the attackers were no longer searching, then they were about to finish the operation. And everyone inside St. Gabriel Medical Center was running out of time. At 4:12 a.m., St. Gabriel Medical Center felt different. The rhythm that had barely held the hospital together for hours was gone. Now there was only anticipation. Something was coming to a conclusion. Everyone could feel it, even if they could not explain why. On the third floor, Ethan Walker stood near the nursing station watching Mark Reyes struggle with a weak, unstable radio signal. Then, a clear transmission broke through. "This is Federal Tactical Command. We have visual perimeter control. Repeat, perimeter control established." A wave of tension moved through the room. Outside help was no longer distant. It was here. But arrival did not mean safety. It meant escalation was entering its final stage. Sarah Mitchell stepped closer to Mark. "Do they have a plan?" Mark listened again. Static. Then fragments. Negotiation failed. Prepping entry teams. Possible hostage concentration in North Corridor. The words were sharp, precise, dangerous. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but his focus sharpened. Entry teams meant movement through the hospital, which meant crossfire risk, which meant patients would be caught between two forces. Olivia Bennett looked shaken. "So it's ending tonight?" Ethan replied quietly. "Yes." A long silence followed. Then a distant sound echoed through the building. A coordinated metallic impact, followed by shouting from lower floors. The attackers were reacting. "Fast." Sarah turned toward Ethan. "They're moving again." He nodded once. "Yes. Faster now." Mark lowered the radio slightly. "They're pushing toward the upper levels." That changed everything. The pediatric wing evacuation had been completed earlier, but several critical patients remained scattered across the hospital. The next phase would determine who survived and who did not. Then, unexpectedly, Mark looked at Ethan again. His voice lowered. "There's something else." "What?" Sarah asked. Mark hesitated. "They're requesting confirmation on a name." That stopped everything. "What name?" Olivia asked. Mark shook his head. "I don't know. It's encrypted. But it's the same thing they've been asking since the beginning." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. A target. Still active. Still unresolved. Sarah looked at Ethan. "You think they're here for one person?" Ethan didn't answer immediately.
Yes.
The single word shifted the atmosphere again. Because now the siege was no longer random violence. It had identity, purpose, direction. At 4:18 a.m., the building shook again. Gunfire echoed from the lower stairwell. Closer this time. Much closer. Emergency lights flickered briefly, then stabilized. People on the third floor instinctively moved closer together. Fear was no longer abstract. It was approaching physically. Mark checked the radio again. "Federal teams are entering from South Access." Sarah whispered, "That's near us." Ethan nodded.
Yes.
Olivia looked between them. "If they come through here, we're in the middle." No one denied it, because it was true. The hospital was becoming a collision point. Ethan stepped slightly away from the station. For the first time that night, his attention wasn't just observing. It was deciding. Mark noticed. "You're thinking ahead again." Ethan responded softly. "If this continues the way it is, the next 5 minutes decide everything." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" But Ethan didn't answer her. Because he was listening now. Not to the room. Not to the radio. But to the structure of the situation itself. Movement below. Shifts in patrol timing. The rhythm of the attackers changing suddenly. Something had broken their pattern. And that meant desperation. Or opportunity. Both were dangerous. A sudden loud impact echoed through the central corridor. Closer than before. People on the third floor moved back instinctively. Emily Carter grabbed a nearby tray table for support. Olivia whispered, "They're here." Mark raised the radio. "Teams report breach on second floor." Sarah looked at Ethan. "What do we do?" This time, the question carried weight. Real weight. Not planning. Not discussion. Action. Ethan looked at the corridor leading toward the stairwell. Then back at the team. His voice was calm. But different. Lower. Controlled. "Listen carefully." Everyone focused immediately. "Stay off the central corridor. Keep patients in interior rooms. Do not engage unless necessary." Mark frowned. "That's tactical instruction." Ethan didn't deny it. Then he added one more line. "And if federal teams enter this floor." He paused briefly. "Follow their command structure immediately." A silence followed. Because now it was clear. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't hoping. He understood escalation patterns. Sarah studied him. "Who are you used to taking orders from?" A long pause. Then Ethan answered. "People who don't panic under pressure." Before anyone could respond, the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor exploded open. Shouting echoed. Fast movement. Heavy boots. Then a voice. "Federal Tactical Unit. Clear the corridor." Armed figures entered quickly, moving with precision. Controlled aggression. Professional containment. One of them paused, scanning the room. Then his eyes landed on Ethan. And stopped. The room didn't notice immediately. But the man did. Something subtle shifted in his expression. Recognition. Not casual. Not uncertain. Confirmed. He stepped forward slightly. "Walker." The name landed differently. Ethan didn't move. Didn't react outwardly. But the air in the room changed. Sarah noticed first. "Do you know him?" she asked quietly. The man didn't answer her. Instead, he spoke again, directly to Ethan. "Command is requesting confirmation from you." Olivia frowned. Confirmation of what? The officer ignored her. His focus remained locked on Ethan. And for the first time that night, Ethan Walker spoke with absolute clarity. "One order is enough." The officer nodded once, then turned slightly toward his team. "Stand by his directive." The words landed heavily in the room. Sarah's expression shifted. Olivia froze. Mark looked between them, confused. Because in that moment, something invisible had changed. Authority had shifted. Not through rank. Not through announcement. Through recognition. Ethan finally stepped forward slightly. Not toward power. Toward control of outcome. Because the next decision would determine how many people walked out alive. And how many did not. At 4:23 a.m., the hospital stopped feeling like a trapped building. It became a controlled battlefield. Federal tactical teams moved through St. Gabriel Medical Center with disciplined precision, securing corridors, clearing stairwells, and establishing communication lines that had been broken for hours. But even with trained forces inside, nothing was simple. The attackers were not disorganized. They were reacting now. Adapting. Changing positions rapidly as they were pushed upward toward the upper floors. On the third floor, Ethan Walker stood beside Commander Jack Mercer, the federal officer who had recognized him earlier. Mercer spoke quietly. They're compressing toward a single zone. Ethan nodded once.
Yes.
Sarah Mitchell stood nearby, watching both of them. She still didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood enough. Ethan was not just assisting. He was directing flow. Not command in the formal sense, but control of interpretation. Mark Reyes, now fully aligned with federal communications, listened to the tactical updates coming through his radio. Second floor cleared. Hostiles retreating toward north stairwell. Possible hostage cluster confirmed near upper conference wing. At that last update, Ethan's expression tightened slightly. Conference wing. The same location he had seen earlier. He turned slightly toward Mercer. That area is where they've been concentrating security. Mercer studied him. You saw that already? Ethan didn't answer directly. Instead he said, it's the only place they protected instead of expanded. That was enough. Mercer accepted it without argument. Because by now, he understood. Ethan Walker was not improvising. He was reading structure. A sudden burst of gunfire echoed from the upper levels. Everyone in the corridor instinctively reacted. Mercer raised his hand. Hold positions. Then into the radio. Do not engage until confirmation of hostage location. The tactical teams slowed. Controlled their advance. Ethan stepped closer to the corridor map mounted on the wall. He traced a route silently with his eyes. Sarah noticed. You know where they are. Ethan replied, I know where they are likely to move next. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed. But it's enough to reduce casualties. A pause followed. Sarah studied him carefully. You're used to this. Ethan didn't deny it. The silence itself was confirmation enough. At 4:30 a.m., the situation reached its most dangerous point. A sudden transmission came through Mark's radio. Hostages confirmed in conference wing. Armed suspect holding position. Requesting negotiation fallback. Mercer listened carefully, then turned to Ethan. This is your call. The weight of the words changed the air. Not because Ethan demanded authority, but because it had already been given to him. Every decision in the past hour had led here. Ethan looked toward the corridor, then spoke. Do not rush entry. Mercer nodded slightly. Explain. Ethan's voice remained steady. Their position to trigger panic response if pressured. Olivia, standing behind them, whispered, They'll kill hostages. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not immediately. That distinction mattered. Sarah frowned. How do you know that? Ethan paused, then answered carefully. Because they've spent too much time protecting the target. Silence followed. Mercer understood immediately. They're not here just to destroy. Ethan nodded. They're here to extract or confirm identity. That changed the entire strategy. Mercer spoke into the radio. Hold all units. No direct breach. A pause. Then, switch to containment protocol. The tactical response shifted. Slower. More controlled. Safer for hostages. But longer. And time was the enemy now. At 4:38 a.m., movement resumed on the upper floors. Attacker positions shifted again. But this time, they were cornered. compressed between federal forces below and blocked exits above. Their options were shrinking, and desperate people make mistakes. A sudden explosion echoed faintly from above. Not large, but intentional. A distraction. Mercer reacted immediately. Secondary team secure stairwell access. Ethan watched carefully. They're trying to break visual control. Sarah looked at him.
Why?
Because they're preparing something inside the conference wing. Olivia's voice shook slightly. Like what? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Because the possibilities were not simple.
Then,
a final move. That was all he said. At 4:41 a.m., federal teams reached visual contact with the conference wing. Tension peaked. Everyone held position. Then Mercer gave the final order. No breach unless Ethan confirms. Every eye turned briefly toward him. Not officially, but functionally. The decision point had shifted. Ethan stepped forward. Slow. Measured. He looked at the radio feed. At the corridor layout. At the last known positions. Then he spoke. Enter from East Corridor. Mercer didn't question it. Execute. Teams moved. Controlled entry. No rush. Precision timing. Inside the conference wing, shouting erupted. A brief standoff. Then silence. Seconds stretched. Too long.
then,
Hostages secured. A wave of relief spread through communications. Not celebration. Relief. Mercer exhaled slowly. Status of suspects. A pause.
then,
One down. Remaining neutralized or contained. The crisis was ending. Slowly. Carefully. At 4:48 a.m., the final attacker resistance collapsed. Federal teams secured the remaining sections of the hospital. Communication lines stabilized. Medical staff began regaining full control of patient care areas. The siege was over. But no one moved quickly. Because endings like this did not feel like victory immediately. They felt like exhaustion. Sarah stepped beside Ethan. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, "You knew how this would end." Ethan looked forward. "I knew how it could end. That's not the same thing again." "No," he agreed. "It never is." Across the corridor, Mark Reyes lowered his radio slowly. Olivia leaned against a wall, visibly drained. Emily Carter sat beside a patient, finally letting her hands stop shaking. Outside the hospital windows, dawn was beginning to form. Soft light replacing darkness. The world continuing as if nothing had happened. But inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, nothing would ever be the same again. At 5:10 a.m., the first real silence of the night finally arrived. Not the silence of fear. Not the silence before gunfire. But the silence that comes after everything has already ended. St. Gabriel Medical Center was no longer under siege. Federal tactical teams secured all remaining access points. The armed attackers were contained or neutralized. Patients were safe. Staff were safe. But no one felt normal. Lights in the corridors were still harsh, but the urgency behind them had changed. Nurses moved again, but slowly. Doctors spoke again, but quietly. Every sound felt like it belonged to a different world than the one they had survived. Ethan Walker stood near the third-floor nursing station. The same place where the night had begun. Now it felt unfamiliar. Like a memory that didn't belong to this building anymore. Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached him. She looked exhausted. Not just physically. Emotionally. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she said quietly, "It's over." Ethan nodded once.
Yes.
A pause followed. Sarah studied him carefully. "I still don't understand you." "That's fine," he replied. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters to me," she said. Ethan didn't answer immediately, because some answers created more problems than they solved. Across the corridor, Mark Reyes spoke with federal command officers, giving final reports on security breaches and structural failures. Olivia Bennett sat on a chair near the wall, staring at her hands like she was trying to confirm they were real. Emily Carter moved between patients, checking vitals that had stabilized but still needed attention. Life was returning. Slowly, carefully, but differently. Sarah stepped closer. "They said your name before," she said. Ethan looked at her. "Who?" "The federal commander." "Mercer." A pause. "He knew you." Ethan remained silent. Sarah continued. "Not like a clerk." Another silence. Then she asked the question she had been holding all night. "Who are you really, Ethan Walker?" For a long moment, there was no response. Only the distant sounds of recovery. Medical equipment being reset. Radio chatter fading into routine coordination. Then Ethan finally spoke. "I used to serve." That was all he said. Sarah waited. But nothing more came. She understood enough not to push further. Because some identities were not meant for hospitals. Or mornings like this. A few minutes later, Commander Jack Mercer entered the floor again. This time without urgency. Only confirmation. He approached Ethan directly. "Report is complete," Mercer said. Ethan nodded. "Good." Mercer hesitated. Then added, "They'll want a statement." Ethan replied immediately. "No." A short pause. Mercer studied him. "You understand they'll still come looking." "I know." "Your involvement changed the outcome." Ethan's voice remained steady. "It changed the outcome for them," he said, glancing toward the staff. "That's enough." Mercer didn't argue. Instead, he simply nodded once. A professional understanding passed between them. Then Mercer stepped back. Before leaving, he said quietly, "You handled it exactly the way they said you would." Ethan didn't react outwardly. But Sarah noticed the smallest shift in his expression. Not pride. Not relief. Something heavier. Acceptance. After Mercer left, the floor slowly returned to hospital rhythm. Not normal, but functioning. Patients were reassigned. Systems checked. Reports filed. Damage assessed. Life continued because it had no other option. Olivia finally stood and walked toward Ethan. Her voice was quiet. "You could have told us." Ethan looked at her. "Told you what?" "That you knew what you were doing." A pause. "You would have treated me differently," he said. Olivia didn't deny it. Because it was true. Emily Carter joined them a moment later. She looked tired but stable. "You were right," she said softly. Ethan looked at her. "About what?" "About one step at a time." A faint silence followed. Then, for the first time that morning, Ethan showed something close to a real expression. Not a smile. Just understanding. As the sun began rising fully outside the hospital windows, the third floor grew quieter. Not from fear. Not from crisis. But from completion. Sarah stood near the window beside Ethan. Outside, emergency vehicles were still present, but the chaos was fading. Order was returning. She spoke softly. "Will you stay?" Ethan looked at the glass. At the morning light. At the hospital slowly returning to its normal shape. "I already did," he said. Sarah frowned slightly. "You know what I mean." Ethan paused. Then replied, "For now." A silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just final. On the floor behind them, patients were being moved to recovery rooms. Staff were writing reports that would later become official records. The night was ending in paperwork and quiet exhaustion. Ethan Walker adjusted his badge. The same badge he had worn all night. The same identity everyone had misunderstood. Then he stepped away from the window. Back toward his work. Not as a hero. Not as a legend. Just a man returning to the place where he had been needed. And as the morning shift fully took over St. Gabriel Medical Center, most people would remember the night differently. Some would remember fear. Some would remember survival. But a few would remember something else entirely. The quiet ward clerk who no one noticed. Until everything depended on him being exactly who he was.